In Auschwitz, the only way out was through the chimney. The system was perfect, the guards vigilant, the fences absolute. They had designed a factory of death from which no one escaped. But they made one mistake. In their arrogance, they failed to account for the mind of prisoner 17421, a quiet architect who looked at their perfect factory and saw nothing but a series of fatal design flaws. The morning roll call at Auschwitz-Birkenau began, as it always did, with the metallic shriek of whistles that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like the cries of mechanical vultures. 30,000 skeletal figures shuffled from their wooden barracks into the mud-soaked assembly ground, their movements carrying the peculiar efficiency of people who had learned that survival meant perfect compliance with inhuman schedules. Prisoner 17421 stood in Block 31, his position calculated to the centimeter based on 6 months of careful observation. At 43, Adam Rosner had been reduced to sinew and bone by starvation rations and 14-hour work details, but his mind remained as sharp as the day the Gestapo had dragged him from his university office in Krakow. Where other prisoners saw only the chaos of systematic terror, Adam saw patterns, structures, weaknesses in what the SS believed was their perfect machine of extermination. The numbers were called with mechanical precision: 17418, 17419, 17420, 17421. Adam stepped forward with the measured pace that avoided drawing attention while maintaining the rhythm that kept the guards from growing impatient. In this place, standing out meant death, but blending in completely meant a slower form of the same end. SS Hauptscharführer Viktor Haas supervised the morning count from his position near the gallows that dominated the center of the assembly ground, his pale eyes scanning the rows of prisoners with the methodical attention of a quality control inspector checking defective merchandise. At 38, Haas possessed the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that had made the Holocaust possible, not the explosive sadism of obvious monsters, but the cold efficiency of a man who had learned to process human suffering like industrial data. Block 31, Work Detail 7, Haas announced, consulting his clipboard with bureaucratic precision. Report to the drainage project, Eastern Perimeter. Adam felt a familiar mixture of calculation and opportunity. The drainage project meant access to areas of the camp that most prisoners never saw. A chance to study the infrastructure that kept this machinery of death functioning with such terrible efficiency. Every work assignment was an intelligence-gathering opportunity for a man who understood that knowledge was the only weapon available to the powerless. The march to the worksite took them past the newly constructed crematorium complex, its brick chimneys rising like fingers pointing accusations at an indifferent sky. Even at this early hour, smoke was already beginning to curl from the stacks, the night shift's work being processed through ovens that ran continuously to keep pace with the Reich's final solution. New transport arrived yesterday, muttered prisoner 19847, a former mathematics professor from Warsaw who walked beside Adam with the shuffling gait that marked men who had given up hope. Hungarians mostly. Families. Adam said nothing, but his mind automatically calculated the implications. Hungarian Jews meant children, elderly, people who would be classified as unfit for work and sent directly to the gas chambers. The crematorium schedule would be running at peak capacity, which meant increased coal deliveries, more frequent ash disposal, higher stress on the electrical grid that powered the ventilation systems. Details. Everything in this hell machine operated according to details that could be observed, catalogued, analyzed by a mind trained to see buildings not as static structures, but as dynamic systems of interdependent components. The drainage project itself was another example of German efficiency applied to the infrastructure of genocide. The camp's location in the marshy lowlands near the Vistula River created persistent flooding problems that interfered with the smooth operation of the extermination process. Adam and his work detail spent their days digging trenches and laying pipe with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of Auschwitz's operations. But while his hands moved earth and stone with mechanical obedience, Adam's mind was mapping the camp's vulnerabilities with the trained eye of someone who had spent 20 years designing buildings that were meant to stand against time and weather and human need. The drainage system revealed the electrical conduits that powered the fence networks. The excavation exposed the communication cables that connected guard towers to the central command post. Most importantly, the work showed him the precise schedule of the power grid that kept the electrified perimeters functioning. "Careful with that pipe, you Jewish pig," snarled Unterscharführer Klein, the young SS guard whose job was to ensure that work details maintained proper productivity levels. At 24, Klein possessed the enthusiastic cruelty of a man who had been taught that brutality was a patriotic duty. "If you break it, I'll have you shot for sabotage." Adam nodded with appropriate deference, while mentally noting that Klein's patrol route took him away from the work site for exactly 11 minutes every 2 hours, when he reported to the guard station for new orders. Such patterns were everywhere if you knew how to look for them, the predictable rhythms of an organization that prized efficiency above all other values. The lunch break, such as it was, consisted of watery soup and a crust of bread that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. But for Adam, it also provided an opportunity to observe the camp's other operations from his position near the kitchen barracks. He watched supply trucks arrive with metronomic regularity, their schedules coordinated with the kind of logistical precision that had made the German war machine so devastatingly effective. More importantly, he watched the Sonderkommandos, the Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, men who had been given the choice between immediate death and participation in their own people's murder. They moved through the camp with the peculiar isolation of people who had seen too much to remain fully human, avoided by other prisoners who understood that proximity to such horror was itself a form of contamination. One Sonderkommando in particular caught Adam's attention, a man of perhaps 50, whose grey hair and hollow eyes had earned him the unofficial nickname, the Grey Ghost. He moved through his duties with mechanical precision, never speaking, never making eye contact, carrying himself like a walking corpse who had forgotten to lie down. But Adam's trained eye noticed something others missed. The Ghost's routes through the camp followed patterns that suggested intimate knowledge of security protocols, guard schedules, and the hidden infrastructure that kept the extermination process functioning. That afternoon, as Adam's work detail continued their excavation along the eastern perimeter, he found himself studying the fence line with the analytical attention he had once devoted to structural engineering problems. The electrified barriers were impressive, multiple layers of barbed wire carrying enough current to kill instantly, supported by concrete posts sunk deep enough to prevent tunneling, monitored by guards whose overlapping fields of fire eliminated blind spots. But every system had vulnerabilities if you understood its design principles. The electrical grid that powered the fences operated on a schedule that conserved generator fuel while maintaining security, full power during the high-risk periods of dawn and dusk, reduced voltage during the day when prisoners were engaged in supervised work details, complete shutdown for exactly 47 seconds every 6 hours when the generators cycled through their maintenance routine. The guard towers were positioned with mathematical precision to provide complete coverage of the perimeter, but their height and spacing created momentary shadow zones during certain times of day when the sun angle was precisely right. The communication systems that allowed guards to coordinate their responses to emergencies ran through cables that were vulnerable to disruption if you knew where to find them. Most importantly, The entire system depended on the assumption that prisoners were too broken, too terrified, too physically depleted to organize anything more sophisticated than individual acts of desperation. The SS had designed their perfect factory around the premise that human beings could be reduced to completely predictable components in their machinery of death. They had never accounted for the possibility that one of their prisoners might possess the intellectual tools to deconstruct their perfect system and identify its fatal flaws. As the workday ended and the prisoners were marched back to their barracks for the evening meal of thin soup and black bread, Adam caught sight of something that would transform his careful observations from academic exercise into desperate mission. A new transport had arrived, cattle cars disgorging their human cargo onto the selection platform, where SS doctors decided with casual efficiency who would live and who would die immediately. Among the new arrivals was a young woman holding two small children, her face bright with the hope of people who still believed that cooperation might lead to survival. She answered the selection officer's questions with desperate eagerness, explaining that she was a seamstress, that her children were healthy, that her family could contribute to whatever work the Germans required. The officer barely looked at her before gesturing towards the left, the direction that led to the gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. The woman's expression shifted from hope to confusion to dawning terror as she realized what was happening. She clutched her children closer, trying to shield them from understanding what they could not possibly comprehend. Adam watched this scene with the detached horror of someone who had witnessed such selections dozens of times. But something about this particular woman's face, the way love and desperation mixed in her expression as she realized she could not protect her children from what was coming, struck him with force that made his chest feel like it was collapsing inward. In that moment, Adam understood that his careful observations and mental mapping were not just intellectual exercises designed to occupy his mind during the slow process of dying. They were tools that could be weaponized against the system that had murdered his wife, his children, his students, his entire world. Survival was not enough. Someone had to escape this place. Someone had to carry the truth of what was happening here to a world that had shown itself remarkably capable of ignoring evidence that challenged comfortable assumptions about human nature and civilized behavior. And Adam Rosner, prisoner 17421, former professor of architecture and structural engineering, began to plan the impossible. The rain fell on Auschwitz with the indifference that marked all natural phenomena, in a place where nature itself seemed contaminated by human evil. Adam stood in the doorway of Block 31, watching water cascade from gutters that carried more than rainwater, ash from the crematoria mixed with the autumn downpour, creating grey streams that flowed toward drainage systems he now understood with uncomfortable intimacy. 6 weeks had passed since the transport from Hungary, since the moment when intellectual curiosity had crystallized into moral imperative. Adam had spent those weeks transforming his observations from casual notation into systematic intelligence gathering, mapping the camp's operations with the methodical precision he had once applied to designing concert halls and apartment buildings in peacetime Krakow. But mapping was only the first step. Escape required more than understanding the system. It required allies who possessed access to areas where ordinary prisoners could never venture, information that could only be gathered by people who worked in the heart of the extermination apparatus itself. The Grey Ghost presented both an opportunity and a challenge that would test every assumption Adam had developed about human nature under extreme conditions. The Sonderkommando moved through the camp with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to divorce his actions from his consciousness, performing tasks that would have driven most people to immediate madness or suicide. Adam had been watching the Ghost's routines for 3 weeks, noting the patterns that governed his movements through areas of the camp that remained invisible to ordinary prisoners. The ghost's work schedule took him from the gas chambers to the crematoria to the storage facilities where the belongings of the murdered were sorted and shipped back to Germany. His routes included access to areas near the outer perimeter, proximity to guard stations during shift changes, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of the security protocols that kept the extermination process running with industrial efficiency. Making contact required calculation that balanced desperate need against catastrophic risk. Approaching a Sonderkommando without proper justification could be interpreted as an attempt to gather information about resistance activities, a crime that would result in immediate execution for both participants. But the alternative, planning an escape without inside intelligence, was equally suicidal. The opportunity came during a supply delivery that required additional labor to unload trucks carrying coal for the crematoria. Adam volunteered for the detail, a decision that earned him suspicious looks from guards who had noticed his tendency to seek work assignments that provided unusual access to camp infrastructure. "You seem eager to work near the ovens. 17421, observed Unterscharführer Klein, with the kind of malicious humor that characterized SS personnel who found entertainment in prisoner suffering. "Perhaps you're homesick for your future accommodations?" "I'm simply grateful for any opportunity to serve the Reich," Adam replied, with the flat obedience that guards expected from prisoners who had learned to subordinate personality to survival. Hard work is its own reward. The response was perfectly calibrated to stroke Klein's ego, while providing no opening for further harassment. Adam had learned that SS personnel, particularly the younger ones, craved validation of their authority through prisoner submission. Offering appropriate deference usually ended conversations that might otherwise escalate into beatings or worse. The coal delivery brought him within 20 meters of the ghost, close enough to observe details that had been invisible from his previous vantage points. The Sonderkommando moved with efficient precision, but Adam's trained eye noticed something others missed: subtle variations in the ghost's routine that suggested awareness of security vulnerabilities, moments of hesitation that indicated careful assessment of guard positions and timing. More importantly, Adam observed how the ghost interacted with the physical infrastructure of the extermination process. His movements revealed intimate knowledge of ventilation systems, electrical conduits, and structural elements that supported the gas chambers and crematoria. The ghost wasn't just performing assigned tasks, he was maintaining mental maps of the most secure areas of the camp. The contact itself had to appear accidental, a chance encounter that could be explained by the coincidence of work assignments rather than deliberate planning. Adam arranged to be carrying a particularly heavy load of coal when the ghost's route intersected with his own, positioning himself to stumble at exactly the right moment to create a collision that would require conversation. "Forgive me," Adam said, as coal scattered across the muddy ground, his voice carrying just enough exhaustion to suggest that the stumble was genuine rather than calculated. "I didn't see you there." The ghost's pale eyes studied Adam with the kind of analytical attention that suggested intelligence operating beneath apparent apathy. For a moment, neither man spoke. But Adam could sense evaluation taking place. The ghost was determining whether this encounter represented opportunity, threat, or mere coincidence. "Help me gather the coal," the ghost said finally, his voice carrying the flat monotone of someone who had learned to speak without revealing emotion. Before the guards notice. They worked together in silence, their hands moving through the scattered fuel with efficient coordination. But Adam understood that this mundane task was actually a test. The ghost was assessing his competence, his awareness of security protocols, his ability to function under pressure without attracting unwanted attention. "You're the architect," the ghost observed as they finished collecting the coal, his statement delivered with matter-of-fact certainty rather than interrogation. "Block 31, drainage detail. You've been watching things, making calculations." The words hit Adam like cold water, confirming that his activities had not gone unnoticed by people who possessed their own reasons for observing camp operations. The ghost's awareness meant either opportunity or immediate danger, depending on motivations that remained opaque. "I watch," Adam confirmed carefully. "I calculate. Old habits from a former life." "Dangerous habits in this life," the ghost replied, but his tone carried observation rather than warning. "Unless you have reasons that make danger worthwhile." They were interrupted by Klein's approach, the young guard's suspicious nature aroused by the sight of prisoners engaged in conversation longer than efficiency required. Adam and the ghost immediately returned to their respective tasks, but the foundation for future contact had been established through coded exchange that communicated shared understanding of unspoken possibilities. Over the following week, Adam arranged 3 more accidental encounters with the ghost, each one providing opportunities to exchange information through conversations disguised as routine prisoner interaction. The ghost possessed detailed knowledge of crematorium operations, gas chamber procedures, and most crucially, the schedule of security protocols that governed the most sensitive areas of the camp. "The ovens run continuously now," the ghost told him during their 3rd meeting, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone reporting statistical data. "New transports every day, sometimes twice daily. The electrical grid is operating at maximum capacity." "Maintenance schedules?" Adam asked, understanding that overtaxed systems required frequent repair cycles that created vulnerabilities in even the most secure operations. "Every 6 hours for primary generators. 47 seconds of complete shutdown for safety cycling. Additional maintenance windows during shift changes when guards are distracted by personnel transitions." The information was delivered with clinical detachment, but Adam recognized its significance immediately. The ghost was providing him with the precise technical intelligence required to plan an escape attempt during moments when the camp's security systems would be most vulnerable. "Why?" Adam asked during their 4th encounter, needing to understand motivations that could either validate or betray any plan they might develop together. The ghost was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant with memories that seemed to cause physical pain. When he spoke again, his voice carried emotion for the first time since Adam had known him. "Because I've seen things that the world refuses to believe, because I've participated in horrors that will haunt me until I die, because maybe helping someone escape with testimony about this place is the only redemption available to a man who has become complicit in genocide." The confession hung between them like a bridge across an abyss, connecting 2 men who had found themselves trapped in circumstances that challenged everything they had believed about human nature and moral choice. Adam understood that the ghost's offer of assistance came not from hope of personal survival, but from desperate need to ensure that someone, somewhere, would bear witness to atrocities that the perpetrators expected to remain forever hidden. "I'll need more than intelligence," Adam said finally. "I'll need access to areas where ordinary prisoners can't go, materials that can only be obtained through your connections, timing that depends on your knowledge of security procedures. And I'll need assurance that if you succeed, you'll tell the world what you've witnessed here. Not just the statistics, but the details that will make it impossible for people to dismiss this as exaggerated propaganda." It was a compact between 2 men who understood that they were planning not just an escape attempt, but a mission to breach the wall of silence that surrounded the Holocaust's most horrific crimes. The Grey Ghost would provide access and intelligence. Adam would carry testimony that could no longer be ignored or denied. As autumn gave way to winter, and the work details became exercises in survival against cold that seemed designed to kill as efficiently as gas chambers, their impossible plan began to take shape with the methodical precision that characterized everything about Auschwitz's operations. The factory of death had been designed to be escape-proof, but its designers had never imagined that their prisoners might include a structural engineer capable of analyzing their perfect system, and a Sonderkommando willing to sabotage it from within. The first phase of their plan would begin in 3 weeks, during the winter solstice, when shorter days and longer nights would provide maximum cover for activities that required darkness. Adam spent those weeks memorizing every detail the ghost provided, transforming intelligence into operational plans that could be executed with split-second timing. He also spent them observing the woman and children from Hungary, watching them perform the impossible task of maintaining dignity and love in a place designed to destroy both. Every day that they survived was another day of evidence that needed to be carried beyond these fences. Another reason why failure was not an option. The architect had finished his blueprints. Now it was time to test whether his calculations could overcome a system that had been designed to make escape impossible. Winter in Auschwitz was not merely cold. It was a weaponized environment designed to complete the work that gas chambers began. The temperature dropped to levels that killed through exposure alone, while the camp's heating systems remained reserved for German personnel. Prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, their breath forming ice crystals that caught what little light penetrated the perpetual grey sky. But winter also brought advantages that Adam had factored into his increasingly detailed escape plan. Shorter days meant longer periods of darkness, when guard visibility was reduced. Harsh weather kept SS personnel indoors whenever possible, reducing patrol frequency and creating gaps in surveillance coverage. Most importantly, the increased demand for coal to heat German facilities created larger work details that provided cover for movement between different areas of the camp. The plan itself had evolved through weeks of careful refinement, each detail tested against the ghost's inside knowledge of security procedures and operational schedules. It was, Adam realized with grim satisfaction, the most complex architectural project he had ever undertaken. Not the design of a building, but the systematic deconstruction of what the SS believed was their perfect fortress. Phase 1 would begin during the evening shift change, when guards were distracted by personnel transitions and administrative duties. The ghost would create a malfunction in Crematorium 4's ventilation system that would require immediate attention from maintenance personnel and guards, drawing security away from the perimeter areas where Adam planned to begin his escape attempt. Phase 2 depended on precise timing with the electrical grid's maintenance cycle. During the 47 seconds when generators shut down for safety inspection, the perimeter fences would lose their electrical charge. Adam would use this window to breach the wire barriers at a point where the ghost's intelligence indicated minimal guard coverage. Phase 3 was the most dangerous. Movement through the outer security zone towards the forest that bordered the camp's eastern perimeter. This would require crossing open ground while avoiding searchlights and patrol units, following routes that existed only in Adam's mental map of the camp's defensive layout. But the plan required more than just Adam and the ghost. Escape attempts by single prisoners had occasionally succeeded in the past, but they inevitably resulted in savage reprisals against entire blocks or work details. To minimize casualties among those left behind, Adam needed companions whose disappearance could be attributed to work accidents rather than organized resistance activity. He identified 2 candidates through careful observation of their survival instincts and psychological resilience. Prisoner 18903, a former engineer from Warsaw named David Kozlowski, possessed technical knowledge that could be valuable during the escape while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for sustained stress. Prisoner 20145, a musician named Samuel Goldstein, whose fine motor control and attention to detail made him ideal for tasks requiring precision under pressure. Approaching them required the same calculated risk that had characterized his initial contact with the ghost, conversations that appeared casual while actually serving as recruitment interviews for an operation that would likely result in death for anyone who participated. "The drainage system is poorly designed," Adam commented to Kozlowski during a work break. His observation delivered with the professional criticism that engineers couldn't resist sharing when they encountered flawed construction, inadequate slope calculations, insufficient capacity for seasonal flooding. Kozlowski's response revealed both technical competence and something more valuable: the ability to think systematically about complex problems even under extreme stress. "The electrical conduits are vulnerable too," he added, after glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Single-point failures that could cascade through the entire grid if someone knew where to apply pressure." The conversation continued through several brief exchanges, each one confirming that Kozlowski possessed both the skills and the psychological profile that Adam's plan required. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that suggested he could adapt to changing circumstances without panic or paralysis. Goldstein proved more challenging to evaluate, his musician's sensitivity making him both more observant of security details and more vulnerable to the psychological pressures that destroyed weaker prisoners. But his musical training had given him extraordinary memory for complex sequences and timing, abilities that could be crucial during an operation where success would depend on split-second coordination. "The guards change positions according to a musical pattern," Goldstein observed during one of their carefully casual conversations, "like a fugue with variations that repeat every 43 minutes. If you can hear the rhythm, you can predict where they'll be at any given moment." The observation revealed not just acute perception, but the kind of systematic analysis that Adam's plan demanded. Musicians, he realized, were natural engineers of time and pattern, skills that could be more valuable than physical strength in an operation that depended on precision rather than force. The recruitment phase took 6 weeks of careful maneuvering, each conversation building trust while maintaining the fiction that they were simply prisoners finding small ways to resist demoralization. But gradually, through coded exchanges and careful observation of their reactions to hypothetical scenarios, Adam confirmed that both men possessed the competence and commitment necessary for an operation that would likely cost them their lives. The final element was materials, items that couldn't be improvised or substituted, tools that required access to restricted areas where ordinary prisoners were never permitted. Wire cutters capable of breaching multiple fence layers, civilian clothing that could disguise their identities during the forest journey, maps showing routes through the Polish countryside toward potential contact with resistance networks. The Ghost's position provided access to storage areas where belongings confiscated from murdered prisoners were sorted before shipment to Germany. Among these personal effects were items that could be repurposed for escape attempts, tools, clothing, documents that might be modified to create false identification papers. "Next transport from Czechoslovakia arrives Thursday," the Ghost told Adam during one of their routine encounters. "Professional families, likely to have quality items that survived the selection process. I can divert specific materials during the sorting procedure." The logistics were complex and dangerous, requiring the Ghost to risk exposure for activities that went far beyond his assigned duties. But his access to these restricted areas was the only way to obtain equipment that couldn't be manufactured or stolen through normal prisoner channels. 3 days before their planned escape date, Adam conducted final reconnaissance of their chosen route, using a legitimate work assignment to inspect drainage systems near the eastern perimeter. The winter landscape was brutal, frozen ground that would make movement difficult, bare trees that provided minimal concealment, snow that would preserve tracks for anyone pursuing them. But the same harsh conditions that made escape more dangerous also reduced the likelihood of immediate pursuit. Guard units rarely ventured outside the camp perimeter during winter storms, preferring to rely on perimeter security and the assumption that escaped prisoners would die of exposure before reaching potential sanctuary. Weather forecast shows heavy snow beginning tomorrow night, Kozlowski reported after overhearing conversation between German meteorologists who visited the camp to assess conditions affecting construction schedules. Visibility near zero, temperatures well below freezing, perfect cover for movement, but also perfect conditions for dying of exposure. It was the classic double-edged nature of all escape planning. Conditions that helped them evade immediate capture also increased the likelihood of death from natural causes. But Adam had calculated that their chances of survival in the forest were better than their chances of surviving continued imprisonment in a camp where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. The night before their attempt, Adam lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, while around him 200 other prisoners snored, coughed, and whispered prayers in languages the SS had tried to erase. His mind ran through every detail of the plan, every contingency they had prepared for, every assumption that could prove fatal if circumstances deviated from their careful calculations. In 8 hours, he would either be dead or free, carrying with him testimony about horrors that the world needed to understand before it was too late to prevent their repetition. The woman from Hungary and her children had been murdered 3 weeks ago, their names added to the millions whose deaths demanded witness, whose stories required voices that could speak for the voiceless. Tomorrow night, prisoner 17421 would cease to exist. In his place, Adam Rosner would either reclaim his identity as a free man capable of bearing witness, or he would join the ashes that rose from chimneys designed to erase all evidence of the Reich's greatest crime. The architect had finished his calculations. Now it was time to discover whether human intelligence could overcome a system designed to make hope itself a luxury that prisoners could not afford. The blizzard began at precisely 1847, its arrival timed with the meteorological accuracy that Adam had incorporated into his final calculations. Snow fell with the intensity that transformed the camp into a landscape of reduced visibility and muffled sound, conditions that would mask movement while creating new dangers for anyone attempting to traverse open ground in sub-zero temperatures. Adam stood at his assigned position in Block 31, listening to the wind howl through gaps in the wooden walls while conducting final mental rehearsals of the sequence that would begin in exactly 43 minutes. Around him, 200 prisoners huddled under threadbare blankets, their conversations reduced to whispers that spoke of desperation, resignation, and the kind of exhausted hope that had learned to hide itself from guards who found entertainment in destroying whatever optimism remained. But Adam was no longer thinking like a prisoner. For the first time in 7 months, his mind operated with the clarity that had once characterized his approach to complex architectural projects: systematic analysis of variables, contingency planning for foreseeable obstacles, acceptance of risks that couldn't be eliminated through preparation. The ghost appeared in the doorway with the mechanical precision that marked all movement in a camp where spontaneous behavior was interpreted as suspicious by guards trained to detect resistance activity. Their final meeting had to appear routine, a chance encounter between prisoners whose work assignments occasionally intersected. "Ventilation system malfunction in crematorium 4, the ghost reported in a voice barely audible above the storm outside. Scheduled for 1930. Maintenance response will draw guards from towers 7 and 9 for approximately 12 minutes. The timing was perfect. A window of reduced surveillance that coincided with the electrical grid's evening maintenance cycle. Adam felt the familiar sensation of complex systems aligning according to calculations that accounted for human behavior, mechanical schedules, and environmental conditions. "Weather will provide cover, but also increase exposure risk," Adam replied, acknowledging the double-edged nature of conditions that helped conceal movement while creating deadly hazards for anyone without adequate protection. "Forest route remains viable despite temperature." They separated without further conversation, the ghost returning to duties that would culminate in sabotage disguised as equipment failure, while Adam made final preparations for an operation that would transform months of planning into reality. Kozlowski and Goldstein received their signals through the coded exchanges they had rehearsed, casual comments that confirmed their readiness while providing no evidence of organized activity that might alert guards to unusual prisoner coordination. Both men acknowledged understanding, with responses that appeared routine while conveying absolute commitment to an operation they knew would likely end in death. At 19:15, Adam began moving toward his initial position near the eastern drainage outlet, his route carefully calculated to avoid guard stations while maintaining the appearance of authorized prisoner movement. The wire cutters provided by the Ghost were concealed beneath his threadbare coat, their weight a constant reminder of tools that could either facilitate freedom or provide evidence for execution if discovered. The blizzard had intensified to levels that reduced visibility to less than 10 meters, conditions that made navigation challenging while creating the concealment that their plan required. Snow accumulated rapidly enough to obscure tracks within minutes, eliminating one of the primary methods guards used to pursue escaped prisoners. At 19:28, the Ghost's sabotage began with a mechanical failure so subtle that investigating guards would find evidence of equipment breakdown rather than deliberate interference. Ventilation fans in Crematorium 4 began operating erratically, creating airflow problems that required immediate attention to prevent dangerous gas accumulation in areas where German personnel worked. Adam watched from his concealed position as guards from Towers 7 and 9 abandoned their posts to investigate the reported malfunction, their movement creating gaps in surveillance coverage that would remain open for exactly the duration required by his calculations. The precision was gratifying, human behavior following patterns that could be predicted and exploited by anyone who understood the underlying systems. At 19:32, the electrical grid entered its evening maintenance cycle, generators shutting down in sequence to allow safety inspections that prevented catastrophic failures. For 47 seconds, the perimeter fences would carry no electrical charge, their deadly current replaced by simple wire barriers that could be breached by anyone with appropriate tools and knowledge of guard positions. Adam approached the fence at coordinates he had memorized through months of observation, his movements synchronized with Kozlowski and Goldstein, who advanced toward adjacent sections of the perimeter according to routes they had practiced through mental rehearsal. The wire cutters worked with efficient precision, each strand parting under pressure that had been calculated to minimize noise while maximizing speed. The breach itself took 31 seconds, time enough to create an opening large enough for human passage while remaining within the window when electrical current was absent from the fence system. Adam was through first, followed by Kozlowski and Goldstein, in sequence that minimized their collective exposure to observation from guard towers that were currently unmanned. Behind them, Auschwitz continued its operations with industrial efficiency, guards investigating equipment failures while prisoners maintained routines that would conceal their absence until morning roll call. By then, they would either be deep in the forest or dead from exposure, but either outcome would be preferable to remaining in a place designed to transform human beings into statistical data in the Reich's records of systematic extermination. The forest beyond the camp perimeter was a landscape of survival challenges that tested every assumption Adam had made about their ability to traverse hostile terrain in winter conditions. Snow made movement slow and energy-intensive, while wind created conditions that could cause rapid heat loss and death from exposure. But the same harsh environment that threatened their survival also provided protection from immediate pursuit. German patrols rarely ventured into forest areas during blizzards, preferring to rely on perimeter security and the assumption that escaped prisoners would die of natural causes before reaching potential sanctuary. Navigation required skills that went beyond Adam's architectural training, But Goldstein's musical memory proved invaluable for maintaining directional orientation in conditions where visual landmarks were invisible. The musician's ability to track complex patterns allowed him to maintain their bearing, despite snow that eliminated normal reference points. "Compass heading 127 degrees, Goldstein whispered during one of their brief rest stops, his internal sense of direction functioning with the precision that had once allowed him to conduct orchestras through pieces that required split-second timing. Approximately 4 kilometers from initial breach point, the distance was encouraging, progress that suggested they might reach their first planned shelter before succumbing to exposure. But Adam understood that every step took them further from the relative protection of familiar territory toward unknown landscapes where survival would depend on luck as much as preparation. Kozlowski proved equally valuable, his engineering background allowing him to assess structural elements in the forest that could provide shelter or navigation aids. "Stream pattern suggests we're moving toward higher elevation," he observed during another rest break. "Should intersect with the road network within 6 kilometers if topographic calculations are accurate." The road network represented their first major objective, transportation routes that could lead them toward Polish resistance contacts while providing potential access to food, shelter, and assistance from civilians who might be willing to help escaped prisoners reach sanctuary. But roads also meant increased risk of encounter with German patrols, checkpoints, and civilian collaborators who might report suspicious activity to occupation authorities. The same infrastructure that offered hope of escape also created new dangers that would test their ability to navigate complex terrain, both physical and political. As dawn approached and the blizzard began to moderate, Adam realized that their escape from Auschwitz had been only the first phase of an operation that would ultimately require them to traverse hundreds of kilometers through occupied territory while carrying testimony that could change the world's understanding of Nazi crimes. The architect had successfully deconstructed the SS's perfect system. Now he had to survive long enough to reconstruct his identity as a witness whose voice could speak for millions who would never again be able to speak for themselves. The partisan safe house was little more than a root cellar carved into a hillside 20 kilometers from the Slovak border. Its entrance concealed behind deadfall that appeared natural but had been carefully arranged to hide the sanctuary where Polish resistance fighters sheltered escaped prisoners and downed Allied airmen. Adam sat hunched over a wooden table, his hands shaking not from cold but from the effort of transforming memory into testimony that could survive his own probable death. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Auschwitz. 3 weeks of moving through forests and villages where survival depended on the kindness of strangers who risked execution for offering bread to escaped prisoners. Kozlowski had died on the 7th day, his body finally succumbing to pneumonia, contracted during their flight through the winter landscape. Goldstein had lasted until the 14th day, before a German patrol caught him foraging for food near a farmhouse, his capture announced by gunshots that echoed through the forest like a death knell. Adam had made the final leg of the journey alone, guided by contacts provided by Polish villagers who understood that some forms of resistance required no weapons beyond human decency. Now he sat in relative safety, but safety that came with the terrible obligation to justify the deaths of his companions by ensuring their sacrifice served a purpose larger than individual survival. The document he was creating would become known as the Rosner Report, 67 pages of technical specifications, organizational charts, and statistical analysis that transformed the industrial machinery of genocide into evidence that could be verified, quantified, and presented to international authorities who had thus far chosen to treat reports of systematic extermination as exaggerated propaganda. The gas chambers are designed with the precision of any other industrial facility, Adam wrote, his architectural training allowing him to describe structures that most witnesses could only experience as incomprehensible horror. ventilation systems calculated to ensure rapid air circulation, door mechanisms engineered to prevent escape once the process begins, capacity specifications that allow for processing predetermined numbers of victims according to schedules that maximize efficiency. Each technical detail was chosen for its potential impact on readers who might dismiss emotional testimony as unreliable but would be forced to confront the systematic nature of crimes described through architectural analysis. Adam understood that his unique perspective as both witness and professional engineer gave his testimony credibility that pure emotional appeal could never achieve. Major Stefan Kowalski, the Home Army officer responsible for evaluating intelligence gathered by escaped prisoners, read Adam's preliminary notes with the grim concentration of a man who had learned to assess the strategic value of human suffering. At 48, Kowalski possessed the weathered competence of someone who had spent 5 years organizing resistance operations while watching his country disappear beneath the machinery of occupation. This level of detail, Kowalski observed, his voice carrying both admiration and horror. You've documented their entire operation from an engineering perspective. Industrial capacity, logistical requirements, administrative procedures, information that allows precise calculation of the scope of their crimes. More than scope, Adam replied, his pen moving across paper with mechanical precision as he translated memory into documentary evidence. Proof of intent. These facilities weren't improvised responses to wartime conditions. They were designed from the ground up for the specific purpose of systematic extermination. Every structural element supports that conclusion. The implications were staggering for international authorities who had preferred to interpret reports of Nazi atrocities as unfortunate excesses rather than deliberate policy. Adam's testimony provided engineering evidence that the Holocaust was not a collection of isolated incidents, but a coordinated industrial program designed to eliminate entire populations with maximum efficiency. Allied intelligence will want verification, Kowalski warned. Independent confirmation from sources who can corroborate your observations. Do you have names, dates, documentation that supports your claims? Adam's memory provided what physical evidence could not. SS Hauptscharführer Victor Haas, administrative officer for Crematorium Complex 2, his personnel files should contain records of optimization studies designed to increase processing capacity. Unterscharführer Klein, guard supervisor, whose reports document prisoner work assignments that allowed me access to restricted areas. The names came easily, each one representing a piece of the bureaucratic machinery that had made genocide possible through careful record-keeping and administrative efficiency. German thoroughness in documentation would become evidence against them once investigators possessed the knowledge necessary to interpret those records correctly. The Grey Ghost, Adam continued, his voice carrying the weight of survivors' guilt that marked those who had escaped while others remained behind. Sonderkommando, assigned to Crematorium 4. His real name was Benjamin Fleischer, former rabbi from Lodz. If he's still alive, he can provide corroboration for everything I've documented. But Adam understood that Fleischer's survival was unlikely, that Sonderkommandos were regularly executed and replaced to prevent them from accumulating dangerous knowledge about the extermination process. The Grey Ghost had sacrificed his life to make their escape possible, accepting certain death in exchange for the possibility that testimony might reach the outside world. Timeline for completion, Kowalski asked, his question carrying the urgency of someone who understood that intelligence had value only if it reached decision-makers quickly enough to influence policy. 2 more weeks for the technical documentation. Additional time for witness statements, organizational charts, statistical analysis that proves systematic rather than random nature of the killings. Adam looked up from his work, his eyes holding the hollow intensity of someone who had seen too much to remain fully human. But Major, You need to understand something about the scope of what they're doing." He gestured toward calculations scattered across the table, numbers that represented human lives reduced to statistical data. Conservative estimates based on observable capacity and operational schedules. They're murdering at least 6,000 people daily across all facilities. 6,000 human beings processed through their machinery of death every single day. The numbers hung in the air like smoke from crematoria, carrying implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and civilized behavior. Even resistance fighters who had witnessed years of occupation brutality struggled to process the scale of systematic extermination that Adam's testimony revealed. "If Allied forces don't act on this information immediately," Adam continued, his voice carrying the desperate urgency of someone who understood that time was measured in human lives, "entire populations will be eliminated before the war ends. The Jews of Hungary, the remaining communities in Poland, populations from across occupied Europe, they're all targeted for complete destruction." Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the weight of information that could save lives if properly utilized, but might be dismissed as incredible propaganda by authorities unprepared to confront the reality of industrial genocide. "We'll transmit your report through multiple channels," he promised finally. "Allied intelligence, Soviet command, neutral diplomatic contacts who might be able to influence international response. Someone will listen. Someone will act." But Adam understood that someone might not be enough, that bureaucratic inertia and psychological denial could delay action until it was too late to save the victims still trapped in the machinery he had escaped. His testimony was a weapon, but weapons were useless unless wielded by people with both power and will to strike back against evil. As winter gave way to spring and Allied forces advanced on multiple fronts, Adam continued his work with the methodical precision that had once characterized his architectural projects. The Rosner report grew into a comprehensive analysis that documented not just the physical infrastructure of genocide, but the administrative systems that made it possible. Organization charts showed how responsibility was distributed across multiple bureaucratic levels to diffuse individual accountability. Transportation schedules revealed the logistical coordination required to deliver victims from across occupied Europe to extermination facilities. Supply records documented the industrial products required to maintain continuous operations: Zyklon B gas, crematorium fuel, construction materials for expanding facilities. Most importantly, Adam's testimony provided evidence that challenged the defense of ignorance that Nazi officials would inevitably claim when called to account for their crimes. The technical sophistication of the extermination apparatus proved that genocide required extensive planning, coordination, and resource allocation that would have been impossible without full knowledge and approval from the highest levels of German leadership. 6 months after his escape, as Soviet forces approached the gates of Auschwitz and German authorities began their desperate attempts to destroy evidence of their crimes, Adam received word that his report had reached Allied intelligence headquarters and was being distributed to military and political leaders who possessed the power to act on his testimony. The woman from Hungary and her children would never know that their deaths had been witnessed, that their suffering had been documented by someone who survived to speak for them. But their memory lived in every page of technical analysis that proved genocide was not accidental horror, but deliberate policy implemented with industrial efficiency. The architect had escaped his cage and carried with him blueprints of hell, testimony that would ensure the world could never again claim ignorance about the price of silence in the face of systematic evil. In the ashes of Auschwitz, truth had found a voice that could speak for millions who would never speak again.